right, welcome back, everybody. We got another episode of the TSV podcast ready for you here. Today, I'm joined by two gentlemen that I'm willing to call my friends. We've collaborated on a number of different projects for TSV. We've been engaging with each other online for a couple of years now. Joe, I've even had the privilege of meeting in person in San Francisco one time when meeting people in person was still a common thing that we did. So I'm happy to introduce Jason Snyder and Joe Norman. Jason is faculty at the Department of Sustainable Development at Appalachian State University. He's also a homesteader and a sometime podcaster. And our readers will recognize that he's a TSV writer. He's written for us about meditation and self-inquiry and embodied cognition. So be sure to check out those essays. I'll link to them below if you haven't seen them before. Joe is an applied complexity scientist. He's done work with the New England Complex Systems Institute, as well as the Real World Risk Institute. He's also quite active on Twitter, and he has a great newsletter on applied complexity that you can find at appliedcomplexity.io. And he's also a homesteader and a localist. So welcome, Joe and Jason. Happy to have you here.
It's great to
be
here.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Adam.
This is cool.
The two of you are doing something that I find really interesting, which is kind of combining two things that a lot of people might see as kind of things in tension, polarities. There's a little bit of a difference between the use of your online personalities. You both have online audiences. You're kind of involved in a lot of online discussions in social media space and podcasts and newsletters and things like that. But really what you're talking about is localism and homesteading. And, you're kind of taking the rest of us along for this journey that we can kind of watch vicariously as you're developing these properties, you're learning new practices, you're, rediscovering in a lot of ways, what was for a long period of human history kind of the default mode of our relating to the land and relating to the world. And so I kind of wanted to just see for so other people can hear, like, what is that relationship for the two of you? Because you have, on the one hand, a very old set of practices meeting with a very new set of practices. And I feel like this is going to become increasingly normal and increasingly important in our world as we, navigate these increasingly uncertain times. So I'm wondering, can you just kind of give us a sense for what is that relationship for you, and what is it doing to your practice, and what is it doing to your relationship to the rest of the online world, which is sort of notoriously kind of ephemeral, not necessarily rooted in place, not necessarily tied to the land in the same way that it is for the two of you?
Yeah, that's a really good and hard question. So I think Jason should feel that.
Well, you've been down this road longer than me, Joe. You've been a big inspiration for me along this path. I'm still kind of navigating this relationship. I think that you're right that we're trying to rediscover kind of traditionalism that was more rooted to place and more rooted to the land and took care of the land. At the same time, history doesn't move backwards. And so I think that there is a role for certain types of what I would call appropriate technology to kind of chart our way forward. And I think the internet, this kind of communication is really what can help make localism viable. I get ideas all the time from people like Joe and other people on what they're doing. A lot of kind of the thinking behind localism I got just from being on Twitter. A lot of just homesteading techniques, permacultural techniques. I get online and I can share with other people. And so I really, I kind of see, what I would call as cosmo-localism or cosmopolitan localism, which is a lot of our production and a lot of our governance is kind of localized at a much smaller scale. But there's still kind of another layer of kind of collective intelligence that the internet provides. And it allows for kind of larger scale collaboration and governance when necessary. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely not our great-grandmother's localism. It's a different kind of localism.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, the information sharing aspect is obviously huge. Certain practices can be place specific, so those don't necessarily transfer. But part of the, like for instance, in permaculture, you work with patterns. They explicitly take this idea of pattern language from Chris Alexander. And the idea of working with patterns is that in each, unique situation, the details will unfold differently, but the relations among things will be maintained. So there's already this kind of language that we can share across distances to kind of catalyze one another's projects. I think there's also, for me at least, a huge psychological component to know there's other people out there that are seeing things in a similar way, that are taking actions in a similar direction. And so it's one of the things we're lacking now locally is this community aspect for many people. And so we're recovering some of that in a non-local way. But I do think there is a bit of a danger in that we never get to the point where we do have like-minded people locally concentrated enough to really affect a political transformation at the bottom, where we start thinking in terms of how do we locally set up so that we can be as self-sufficient as possible within our town, within our county, within our state. These kinds of things do need to be addressed, and a lot of them do demand real world physical interaction. So there is a tension, but it's not a fatal tension, and it can be resolved as long as we understand that we can't just be sort of atomized individuals or even atomized families that are sort of maximally distributed in physical space. At some point, something's got to give. We need to have, I've been referring to them as local concentration zones, where you have enough people together where you can do things like work share. You can partially specialize. I'm raising hogs. Maybe Jason down the road is raising cattle. These kinds of things. If we're to get back to somewhere that's really a function of localism, we will need that. And it's something that I continue to try to inject into the conversations that I'm having. And I don't know how we get there, because we do have a little bit of a stalemate in that, well, we're all choosing our kind of locations. And one of the things we're all seeking is to really put roots down. I think that's something that in our generation, a lot of people are now consciously realizing that, there was this sense that we could kind of get up and place was fungible and you could move around. You could do it as many times as you want. There's really no loss associated with that, but there is a cost associated with it. And each place is so hyper specific that you need to spend a lot of time there to develop it and to develop your understanding of it. So it's something I'm trying to work through myself, Adam. How do we reconcile these issues? Because like we set down in New Hampshire, and we're meeting more and more people that are doing similar things. But so far, I mean, there are people I've met in town, not on the internet, but in this sort of social media domain. So far, no one's that close by that we're really physically transacting with one another in a way that would be kind of nice to do.
Yeah. So one thing I'm hearing here kind of that's emerging is this relationship between the sort of cosmopolitan kind of more a mindset that we traditionally would have associated with kind of urban areas versus kind of more rural communities, which for a long time have also represented sort of two very different political groups with different political interests, different political priorities. And that tension, seems to be at the root of a lot of the kind of polarization, at least in the United States, as far as I can tell, that you have very different groups of people who have different needs in different parts of the country, kind of being forced into these low resolution camps of decision making that's happening very far away. Even if people are sending representatives from all over the country, you're not getting that nuanced, very specific kind of action that needs to happen. And what I'm hearing from the two of you is that you're actually kind of combining that sort of more cosmopolitan image, as Jason was saying it, with the rural living, which strikes me as a kind of a new combination. And it seems to be like maybe the combination that we really need right now, because before, perhaps because of technological barriers, you kind of had to pick one or the other, but now there's this kind of we're seeing in so many ways mutations, unexpected kind of hybrids of shuffling of categories that make the old divisions kind of almost nonsensical. Like you've both commented on how inadequate left and right politics kind of are to this moment. So what does that look like from your perspective? Like where are we in terms of some of these transformations, and do we have an opportunity here? Maybe we've just gone through a very chaotic year. It looks like 2021 is really stepping up to the plate to make things even weirder. Are new options emerging, and what do those look like for you?
I mean, the low hanging fruit here is the new option that's emerging all over the place is remote work. So indeed, not only can you kind of interact in a social way, even if you're in rural life in a cosmopolitan type of way, but you can earn an income that's traditionally associated with being in or very near a city. That being said, that's basically what I'm doing, and it's a huge challenge. One of the things that's a real wake up call if you start getting into homesteading or pretty much any of the activities associated with it, they are enormously demanding in terms of time, in terms of physical labor as well, a lot of times, but in terms of time. And when you're kind of trading off your time between your remote work and your, working the land, it's not always easy. And especially when you're coming like I am, and I think maybe Jason is, with very little experience of this kind in your upbringing and your background, things that for sort of an old timer, someone who's been around doing this stuff for a while, might be kind of routine, take a long time to start to develop the know-how. So there are definitely new opportunities. Remote work is one of them. I'm working to first take my remote work more and more, make it more aligned with my personal mission, my personal values, what I'm trying to achieve, first of all, and then also transitioning to more local activities. And the pandemic situation has really thrown a wrench in some of my plans. I was hoping in the next couple of years to start having in-person classes and conventions, conferences, whatever you want to call them. And we'll see how that looks in the next couple of years, but right now that's not as feasible as it used to be. So there's definitely new mutations. I also just want to say one comment, because I think a lot of times, the way Jason and I are doing this, it's certainly a rural type of setting and all of that, but localism doesn't necessarily imply that you're living rural. I mean, you can have a city that's very much invested in localism, and that would look like the neighborhood is very much invested in itself, and the city itself is very much invested in the city, and maybe the surrounding land is less sprawl and maybe more farms like it traditionally was, where you'd have the city and then a very clear boundary of the city and then farmland, and that farmland was what was feeding the city, rather than sort of these global imports and whatnot and long range supply chains. So it's not necessarily the case either that localism implies living rural. That being said, obviously, at right this moment, also related to the pandemic, city living is more difficult than it's been, and there is an opportunity to get land for, I think, what will look historically like very, very good deals. I think that who said it? Like buy land. I think Mark Twain, buy land, they ain't making it anymore. Sounds like Mark Twain anyway. Bitcoin has a finite supply, land has a finite supply. And just to circle back on something I mentioned, the sooner, if you are interested in these things, the sooner you can pull the trigger, the better, not only because of my sort of real estate thesis there, but because it does take so long to learn what the hell you're doing. And something I mentioned in just a recent conversation with Colin on the Colin of Zion podcast is that really what's been an eye opener for me is that the time scales are not long in my lifetime, but longer than my lifetime. And so, the projects are big. They're not short things, and it can change your perspective on sort of how you prioritize and allocate your time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything Joe said, and so perhaps I'll just be reiterating a lot of it. I do think that the pandemic has shifted the calculus for a lot of people, at least in my social media sphere. I do think remote work can be a bridge. It's not the destination, I don't think. I think remote work can allow you to settle in a place where you can live a more localist lifestyle, whether it's in a city or in the country. But eventually, I think the goal is to invest some of that income into local economy and get a greater source of your livelihood locally. right? Whatever that means, whether it's starting like becoming a market gardener or, whatever that means for you. I also, Joe mentioned supply chains and the fragility of supply chains. I also tend to think that highly, dependent cities, specialized cities are going to have a hard time moving forward. I could be wrong, but I just look at like, energy supplies, potential energy crunches. I look at, ecological shocks to the supply chains. And like Joe said, the quicker that we can start the process, like we're both very early in the process. I'm not even anywhere near being self-sufficient or, even really knowing my neighbors yet. Part of it is I moved here right when the pandemic was starting. And so I've only just briefly gotten to know, a couple of my neighbors, but, it really takes, years, decades to really establish something long-term. And the earlier that people can get started on that process, the better.
And it strikes me that it's not necessarily the case that, you move rural, and it doesn't mean that just now you're living rural, that you're living in a localist situation.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is I can, for instance, choose to purchase all our foods from local farms, local growers, and they can turn around and spend that money at Walmart, and they do. And it's sort of like, it hurts a little bit to see that, because it's like, oh no, you should spend it back in again. We need those circular flows of currency happening as locally as possible. And then you start to get all kinds of multiplicative side effects. And that's really, one of the reasons that I'm so pro localism, is for those kinds of dynamics to become manifest. So there's the problem that even rural living now is not by default localist. There are strains of it, but you'll find that there's a insensitivity to, for instance, depending on global supply chains from at least most of the folks that I've found that were already, living where I am. So it's a huge challenge. And it's one of the things that I want to, like, I have similar kind of beliefs going forward as Jason, that we have this huge amount of fragility in this global structure now. And it's not, we don't know what exactly will happen, but something will happen. We've seen only hints of it, I would say, with COVID. Yeah. It's like, if you think COVID was bad, just wait, because these things, instead of sort of the kind of policymakers that should make whatever you call them, instead of stepping back and saying, whoa, look at how fragile this situation is. How can we rethink how we're doing this? We've actually doubled down on each step. And it's the mom and pop shops that are going out of business, and it's the Amazons that are getting boosted. And so I don't want to make the impression at all that I believe that we know the way ahead. All I know is that if you are able to, say, localize your dependencies, when these disruptions of the large scale things do occur, you're going to be in a better situation. And not only you, but everyone involved in that. But how we get there, I'm personally very much struggling. How do we socially, collectively actually get to this place? We have the kind of, I'll sort of put ourselves out there and say, yeah, you have I'll call us pioneers, but really not. But in some sense, in this certain kind of online space, we're kind of like pioneers in that most people haven't bothered to go buy land and do this kind of stuff, even people that are interested. But, it's going to take something more than that to actually get us to where we need to be with enough buffer time to make things happen. And I'm kind of worried about it, if I'm totally honest.
One of the things that I was observing, especially at the onset of the pandemic, honestly, a lot of it spurred on by you, Joe, and your early kind of warning signs. And even then, the way you framed it was very much the way that you're framing risk in general right now. Is like, I don't know what's coming, but I see that there are dominoes lined up here, and that one of these pathways is really bad, and we could just head that off right now, and then we don't have to think about it. We could just stop it in its tracks right there. Or maybe that ultimately was impossible, but we could have done it in different ways to minimize the risk. And one of the things that at first made me feel kind of optimistic and even a little bit excited was that online, I felt like there was a tremendous amount of good sense being made, actually, in certain pockets. Like, if you could find them, there was early kind of intelligent response that seemed like, oh, this is a strategy. And then comparing that to the level of information and communication being put out by legacy institutions, legacy media, and especially the sort of the political and national apparatuses that are responsible for dealing with these things, it just seemed like night and day. We really didn't meet this challenge in anything like the way we could have. And I think the fact that the messaging was so bad kind of led to, in my view, the emergence of these sort of counter narratives that were kind of even worse than the mainstream narrative. And I think it was because even if you don't know exactly what the right thing to do is, and you don't know about epidemiology and complex systems dynamics and things, you can feel like that the messaging is off. And that opens you up to kind of like potentially even worse alternatives that, the internet makes, readily available. What I'm getting at is like, I feel like we have resources and we have good people who are thinking through these things. They're just not at the levers they need to be at. And communication is an important part of that. Media is an important part of that. Ideas and, this kind of thing is an important part of kind of driving in that direction. But it seems like we're falling short of being able to kind of cross into that other landscape where people who aren't very online, people who aren't in these kind of niche communities are also that's just what they have available to them as kind of a part of the course of their day,
I want to bring up something that you mentioned before that I didn't respond to, and that is this, both Jason and I kind of push back on this left-right dichotomy sort of framing all of our politics. And one of the reasons I'm attracted to what we're calling localism is because it puts at the center, it says the most relevant variable in whatever politics you're interested in is scale. At what scale are you talking about this policy? Mm-hmm. How big is the system? How centralized is the system? How decentralized is it? And one of the things that sort of links back to the theme of why we're talking here, this tension between maybe the internet non-local and this idea of pursuing localism. Well, when us three get together, this is non-local, to be sure, but it is not large scale and it is not centralized. It's very much a distributed type of activity. So, I'm growing increasingly cynical about our ability to actually affect the legacy institutions enough to do the right thing, or as you kind of put it, put the right people in the right places so they can pull the levers. Maybe those levers shouldn't exist because it is so, let's say, impossible or extremely unlikely to have the right person in the right place to pull those levers. In fact, one of the things I've really come to appreciate is, as you mentioned early on in the pandemic, I did some work, put out a paper with Nassim Taleb and Yanir Baryam. That was back in last January. So we were relative to some others on the early side. And at that time, I was thinking in terms of large scale policy, like we need to restrict flights, for instance, which was an obvious thing that we did a little bit, but should have done a lot more of. That instantly got wrapped up into sort of standard Democrat versus Republican politics and completely ruined that ability to discuss that in a clear way. So I was thinking in terms of those large scale policies. Now, a year plus into this thing, we can look and say, well, who actually succeeded? Who's doing well? Mm-hmm. And you have places like Taiwan, you have places like New Zealand. And a lot of people say, well, those are islands. So that's sort of their explanation of what's going on. The thing is, you can make an island on land. An island in this sense just means that, traffic in and traffic out is minimal. So it's not something about, the water is cleansing the air, something like that, that's a red herring. It's island. No, what it was is that they're small enough to react coherently to the situation. They were clear-headed enough to not get wrapped up in the politics of border control and border policy and make it about, who's going to win the next election, this kind of thing. I came into the pandemic fully convinced that we need to pursue localism. And as the pandemic unfolded, I said, get your, look for your local farmers, buy from them. Like, this is the time to make sure that you're not depending on these long range supply chains. But now I'm seeing I should have been even more adamant about the need for localism to actually achieve any kind of reasonable reaction to an event like this. Some are framing it that, this is a pandemic, meaning it's global, therefore you need global scale policy. Guess what? We had institutions and have them at the global scale that got everything wrong. Back when I was saying, hey, we should stop the flights, World Health Organization was saying, there's no evidence that this, that, or the other thing. So please, keep flying. Don't change your plans. And so that shows you why global scale policy is a non-starter for mitigating this kind of risk, because the moment they get it wrong, the whole world gets it wrong. So actually, even though we're looking at a problem that is spanning the globe, the solution is to have smaller units that have the possibility of making the right decision. Doesn't mean they will. Many will make the wrong decision. But as you get those pockets of good decision making, a few things can happen. You can start to link them back together in terms of mobility and traffic flow. You can look at what they've done that was right and mimic it. Obviously contexts are different, so it's not always that mimicking a policy will have the same outcome in a different place, but you can start to learn and look at what's going on. So, and the key here, and one of the reasons that we are sort of in this modern era uncomfortable with what that really would look like, is it would mean a lot more borders at a lot smaller scales. For instance, things that did happen or have happened in transient ways in the US would have been obvious to do, like interstate travel that's non-essential, that's not about moving goods and services, for instance, or moving goods. We could have put quarantines on entering states that you haven't been in. Bringing our policy back locally actually looks like the best approach to most global scale problems as well. The sooner that we can accept that and not kind of pin it on, oh, that's a left position, that's a right position, and get into this infighting that's really solely about labels, the sooner that we can actually move forward, hopefully develop a new coalition of people across the US at least, that see that, Dems versus Republicans, left versus right, this is kind of a sideshow and a distraction. And what we really want is to all live in peace, live well, be part of a community, and have a place for our kids to grow up and thrive and build their lives. I continue to be at a loss as I say these things about like, what's the next step? Because I'm constantly in tension with myself around, well, is the next step for me to go down to my town hall meeting and champion for the policies that we have in town that I think would help? And the answer to that is obviously a yes. But is there another component I need to be pursuing at a larger scale? Or is that in some sense hypocritical if I go pursuing these policies at larger scales? And one thing that I definitely see is there are voices, Justin Amash, I think it's Amash, you say it, for instance, has a lot of attention, former congressman, and he's saying, we need to decentralize. Well, he was in Congress, and I would want to know from him, for instance, like, okay, you're sitting in Congress. Do you think any of the people sitting in Congress are going to choose to decentralize? And I would assume no, pretty much none of them. They like the central power. And so what is the sort of political way forward to reassert a decentralized situation from the bottom, to pull back the power? I think there are some interesting ways forward around that, but we need to think together and to get our collective heads around this problem.
My training was kind of, in the kind of a technocratic paradigm, applied economics PhD. And so if you had asked me 3 years ago, the gears in my head would be turning about these kind of large scale technocratic solutions. And these days, I think my mind is completely flipped. I leave it to Joe and other smart people to think about these kind of larger scale, localist, larger scale policy solutions. For me, it's just like, this is my first year as a homesteader, starting as a homesteader, and this pandemic has reinforced kind of my localist sensibilities. And so it's kind of getting my own house in order. So that's like, big on my mind. But connecting with other homesteaders, with other, people in this larger movement, which I would also include like the decentralization movement in general, the regeneration, bioregional regeneration people, somewhat game B. I think we're all seeds. Like we're all, the people who are responding and changing their life, we're all planting seeds in different places. And like Joe said, it would be better if, we had these kind of concentrated pockets. And I hope that happens. I think, maybe New Hampshire is a great place for that. And I'm really hoping to attract people to, down here to Western North Carolina, Southern Appalachia area, because I think this would be a great place as well. But like for me, I'm seeing that the current legacy institutions are going to be crumbling on their own accord. And I really do think that more and more people will start waking up to the need for change. And so for me, it's all about how do we build the infrastructure to accommodate people coming in and getting them set up very quickly, right? And going very quickly, because rural areas aren't necessarily localist. There's kind of a localist tradition where I am, but farmers mainly grow, hay and cows. And they used to have much more diversified kind of livelihood strategies. From what I've read in the past, I mean, some of them still have like outdoor gardens and stuff. So there's still a little bit of that foundation there. So for me, it's starting in my own community, trying to hopefully get to know my neighbors more soon, get involved with local politics maybe. But going back to what we're doing online, I have people, I'm sure it's the same with Joe, I have people reaching out to me all the time saying like, hey, the stuff you're posting is inspiring to me. Like, can you give me some advice? And that's like one of the best things, the best things in the world, because I see it as, we're building a new type of civilization in the ruins of the crumbling one. And I think depending on how quickly the old institutions crumble, and how quickly people change course, like that's very uncertain, right? Like there could be 11 cracked eggs, or there could be 2 or 3 cracked eggs, and it doesn't, right? And hopefully we can minimize that by laying foundations.
One sort of high level concept that I heard Joe just mentioning was that we kind of have this, I'm characterizing a little bit, but in the public imagination, we sort of have had a lopsided and positive view of connection. Interconnectivity is good, and more of it is always better. And now we're going through this phase where we have to kind of take a more mature and granular look at that and say, actually, some forms of interconnection are very bad. And we're hyper connected in some ways that's making us more vulnerable. So, like, what are some of those other things that might help us orient to these systems? What are some of the other things that you're watching that are kind of like maybe on the horizon? Or how are just people not steeped in this stuff supposed to kind of make sense of things?
Well, I'll answer that slightly obliquely in that, there's this whole public discussion around sense making and how do we make sense of what's going on and all that. There's sort of a meta level where you have to look at things and sort of partition them, say, into classes of things that you maybe can make sense of, and then also the area where there's no sense to be made here. And I think, right now we're obviously going through some kind of a transition. And so there's a reorganization and a restructuring of our world happening with us inside of it. And some of those things are not going to make sense. So I think from sort of a meta sense-making perspective, first we need to look at it and say, we can't expect everything to make sense. And in fact, this is one of the sort of, I'd say, big lessons that comes out of, for instance, the work of Nassim Taleb. It's not that, hey, you're going to, study up, figure out all the details, and then you'll know everything that's going on. Part of what we need to do is to think, given that there are these massive uncertainties in the world, how do we structure our own lives? How do we structure our exposure so that whatever the random things that happen are, they either don't harm us too much or maybe even help us? And the other way I like to kind of rhetorically turn this on its head is usually when we think of make sense of something, we're really focused on the sense side, sort of passively receiving information and then like putting it into a model that sort of puts things in place and relates them to one another. And I think that a huge part of making your life make sense going forward is in the word make, not in the word sense. You need to start actually building the things around you that have some kind of internal coherence, that have some kind of internal harmony associated with them. And those things will make sense. You start building a garden and you go out and your garden makes sense. You put things in place, certain things that turn out to be, not good decisions. Even those mistakes make sense. Oh, I put this here with thinking this would happen, but I didn't think of this side effect. And now, next year I won't do that. So I think there needs to be a very active approach to kind of making sense out of what's going on. And that is to start building yourself. And, this is tied in my mind with this whole idea that, what are we heading towards globally? Or what are the legacy institutions imagine we're heading towards globally, I should say. And that is pretty much a 2-tiered system. It's sort of like the elite and then kind of consumers. And pretty much almost everyone, the majority of the population of Earth are to be consumers. Reorient, get out of the consumer headspace and start producing. And producing doesn't necessarily mean I'm producing to sell things on the market. It might, and it could, and it should. But it can also just mean I'm producing my own table. I needed a desk and I made it. I'm producing this music. I could have got onto Spotify, but instead I picked up a guitar and now I'm producing. Like, we really have succumbed in a large way culturally to this consumer mindset. And I think it's just poison for us. I think it's completely toxic, and nothing will make sense as long as your social identity is I'm the consumer. I purchase my entertainment, I purchase my food, and everything kind of comes in from the outside and it keeps me alive, and just to do it another day. So to wrap up on that kind of tangent, there's some things that you won't make sense out of. Actively seek to create a local environment in which things do make sense, and things will start making a lot more sense. You won't have to parse all of these large scale dynamics. Although I do think it is a good side effect actually for things like Wall Street bets. And you're like, well, what in the hell is a short? What is going on here? Like this kind of mass scale education that's happening, this sort of self-education that's happening. I actually think that's a really good thing overall, because you start to see the structure of the things that have been underlying things for a while, but were sort of peripheral or kind of obscure and opaque. And it's like, oh, this actually has a huge bearing on the structure of my life. And it turns out that there's no magic in it. It's kind of a bunch of bullshit. And so this is actually a very good thing, I think, because it is catalyzing people's ability to change their mindset, or at least start looking for like, what's the other way? What's a different way to look at how I structure my own life for the future?
Wendell Berry in his book Unsettling America comes to mind, and when he talks about how we become so specialized that we've become very detached from kind of the sources of our sustenance. Small scale farmers were, some of the original generalists, right? Like they knew how to do many different things related to their sustenance. And of course, they didn't produce everything for themselves. There was some specialization within a village type of economy, perhaps a little broader. But I think part of this, people not knowing what's going on, is becoming detached from the source of our sustenance and becoming dependent on the system that provides it, which is consumerism. So you might be very specialized, you might be a programmer and you know how to do one thing really well, but if the system that provides that breaks down, you're out of luck. You can't really do anything else. And I think that just creates this layer of abstraction that can easily be manipulated, right? Through, various players that don't have your best intentions in mind. And so for me, making sense is exactly what Joe said. It's getting in touch with the sources of your sustenance. Where does your water come from? Where does your energy come from? Where does your food come from? Things like this, just kind of tracing it out, thinking bioregionally. What if supply chains were to break down for a while? Like where does this stuff come from? Can you find alternative ways to procure these things? To me, that's, that like getting back to the physical is how to make sense.
You made me think of a couple things there, Jason. One is that the food thing is a really good example of the difference between trying to make sense out of what's happening and then creating some sensible situation. Like I could pick up my burger patties from Walmart and I could try to figure out, where the hell did this beef come from? Like what else is in here and where did it come from? And, you might find, there's 1,000 different cows in this beef. Like what the fuck? Yeah. Much easier way to make sense out of where's my hamburger coming from is to go down the street and purchase it from my neighbor who raised the cattle. And so that's like sort of a difference between making sense out of the craziness versus just doing something simple. The other thing that you kind of sparked to me as you were speaking was this idea of generalist versus specialist. And I think one of the things you were saying was that we tend to kind of think economically that there's sort of, you either specialize or you don't, and you do everything kind of shittily. And so specialization is more efficient economically, this and that. But one of the dimensions that gets lost in that model is there's a difference between specializing in terms of behavior, what I end up doing, and specializing to the degree that I lose capabilities. So if I needed to step in and do something different than what I'm doing, would I even know how? And so like, we might live in a village and I might focus on making cheese while my neighbor focuses on producing the milk that makes that cheese. But, if my neighbor grew ill or something, I could hopefully step in there and help them milk the cows, things like this. And I wouldn't be at a loss like, hey, look, I'm a cheesemaker. I can't do that. So when we think about, specialization and being generalists and whatnot, it's in part, what do you do? But it's also, what can you do? What experiences do you have? How broad is that range of experiences? And so much of where I think we need to go is gaining a much broader set of skills so that we can be adaptive and flexible and change what we're doing. And we don't need to take all of those skills to like the most sophisticated artisanal levels they could possibly go to. Sort of good enough is good enough. So if I have, some pipe is leaking in my basement, and maybe I won't be like an artist like some amazing plumber would be, but if I can stop the leak, then we're good. And so I think we need to kind of get to back to that kind of generalism where our experiences are broad and we can adapt what we're doing according to the situation without this sort of, let's call it a straw man kind of image that's thrown into the mix, where it's like, oh, you're in favor of self-sufficiency. Well, that means you have to do everything yourself every time. And that's just not, that will keep you in poverty. I think that that's completely untrue. I know people just in my town that can do many, many, many things. They don't do a lot of them most of the time, but they're able to, and they've learned them, they've had those experiences, and that makes them much more robust and much more resilient to the kinds of, random perturbations and things that we experience more and more now.
Right. Minimum viable capability.
Yeah. Minimum viable capability. Exactly.
Yeah.
Nice.
Which is kind of analogous to localism. I think of localism as minimum viable scale. And that actually got that from you, Joe, in that initial conversation.
Listening to the two of you talk here and just thinking in my head about the trajectory that I've seen you both go on, it strikes me actually that I didn't actually think about this too explicitly before, but you both also share a particular view of human cognition and human perception that I think really lines up with Joe, especially what you were just saying about, this kind of two-tiered world system where you essentially have an elite population and a consumer population. That view shares like a kind of an opposite view of human cognition and subjectivity from where you both kind of start. And I think that's interesting because if you just lay it out for a second, the view that underlines that kind of consumerist mindset basically suggests something like all humans everywhere are to some extent sort of invariant blank slates, and all places everywhere are potentially, like you were saying earlier, Joe, replaceable. You could be in North America or Canada or England or France, but from the perspective of sort of global consumer culture, you're just kind of shuffling around in places that don't have intrinsic value. And so it's interesting to me that, a different view of human cognition, which suggests that cognition is sort of deeply specific, primarily practical, primarily rooted, coupled to the specificities of your environment, also grows out into, a different kind of social view, a different kind of political view, a different kind of ecological view. And so this is just kind of emerging for me right now, listening to you talk. Like, is that a relationship that you've kind of thematized for yourself, or like, because it seems almost like if you wanted to kind of intentionally construct a coherent system, you've done that. But I feel like you didn't set out to do that. At least that's the impression that I have.
I mean, I've stumbled into it. So, I mean, I was a big meditator, still am. I'm not as intense as I used to be. But part of why I started meditating was that I was reaching the limits of my propositional thinking. I kept, getting stuck in these mind loops and just making myself miserable and trying to rationalize my way out of my emotional and social problems. And what I, discovered, through various meditation techniques is that it all comes back to the body. And so then I started reading the enactivist literature, and embodied cognition became all of a sudden, a wake up for me. And then, connected to embodied cognition is situated cognition, right? And so that for me naturally led to when I started hearing about localism, sense of place, more ecological consciousness, like all of that resonated with me because I had already experienced that in my own mind, in my immediate kind of mind and body. It definitely wasn't, I didn't plan it from the beginning, but I just kind of stumbled down this path, which in retrospect seems pretty coherent.
Yeah, on the theme of specialist versus generalist, and kind of developing know-how to do things like the kinds of things that homesteading demands, I'm constantly seeking to expand what I'll call my affordance space.
Right.
It's interesting because you're always kind of living at the edge of it, because with the things that you know how to do already, you just kind of do, and it's I don't want to say unconscious, but it's feels easy in some sense. There's not much to figure out. You know what you're doing. So you're always noticing where you're at the edge of that. So it's interesting to kind of compare objectively like the skills I've gained since deciding to pursue this kind of lifestyle, where I always feel stupid. I always feel like I don't know what the hell I'm doing. But if I look kind of back at like, well, where were we? I look back at some old photos of our first garden and stuff, and I'm kind of like, holy shit, like what was I doing? So there's this sense in which know-how is the crucial kind of knowledge for what we're talking about. And all of the, talking and propositional stuff is kind of can be useful, can be fun, can be detrimental, but it's not kind of the main player here. And this, I think that developing know-how and continuing to expand that know-how over time, and both in terms of kind of laterally expanding a new skill, but also kind of vertically expanding, putting things into larger and larger contexts. I think it's very human to pursue that kind of development of one's know-how. And being a consumer actually puts you right in this sort of very bounded container where there's no room to expand actually your know-how. And I think this is related to a lot of the alienation that many people are experiencing. Sure. It's like we're literally evolved to like develop skills, invent new skills, and to kind of elaborate on all those affordance spaces. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. The other is I more and more see that this really is a phenomenon that exists over multiple scales. So as an individual, there's a kind of know-how that I need to develop to accomplish certain things I want to accomplish. As a family, there's a kind of know-how. It's not an explicit kind of knowledge. It's a learning how to live and interact together so that we can make some coordinated kind of progress that requires the whole family to be involved. At the town scale, say village, town, one of the things we've lost is that sort of, call it town scale know-how. And in fact, there's no way to construct kind of collective behavior in an explicit, rationalistic way. You can only evolve it. And part of the reason I'm so adamant about kind of choosing a place and staying put and hoping others do something similar is that only through staying put can we have the time scales we need to actually co-evolve those local know-hows that are collective at the collective scale in terms of it's many individuals, but small in terms of, I'm not talking about a country or a state, but just a town. Like, how do we behave together as a coherent or at least coordinated entity? So I think the sort of know-how and inactivist, situated cognition, and all of these ideas are indeed crucial in terms of, you don't necessarily have to study it academically, but in terms of conceptually, there's a crucial aspect of this building out networks of know-how at multiple scales.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just add, a small thing I'll just add is that, like Joe, things seem difficult at first. Like, when we were thinking about building a chicken coop, my wife's father was in town, and he helped us with the initial design and getting the initial materials, but we ended up building most of it. And I've never really built anything before. And after we built it, I was like, wow, like that, like what else can I build? Like all of a sudden my affordance space increased. And one other thing that, I'm starting to see, I've more read about, so it's still a little bit theoretical for me, is this idea of function stacking. And the more you're in a place and the more you're testing, your affordance space and trying different things and things are evolving, you start seeing interactions among these different elements of your system, whether it be internally, within the family, within your homestead, et cetera. And you start seeing these kind of synergetic effects that can really be leveraged that, again, just can never have been planned top down. The models are just too, I can speak for economic models, like they're so simplistic and stupid, partly because it's not mathematically tractable to do calculus with reality, really, right? And so they have to make these really dumb models that don't really, often have unintended consequences.
I think people are often surprised if they meet me and I explain, I'm involved in applied complexity science. They're often then become very surprised when they find how cynical I am about building models that are meant to explicitly represent a system and then be like leveraged to gain some insight. Like that can happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It can happen. But in most cases, you just become sort of myopically infatuated with the model, and you're missing what's the real crucial variables of the system. So I agree. You can't really apply the models in a very direct way most of the time. Yeah, I really love this idea of the expanding affordance space. And what you start to see is that things, and I think this is again related to this kind of consumerist mindset where things kind of come pre-packaged. This is the entity and it is how it is. It is just that way somehow, some magic in the background is producing this thing. And then you start to look and you see things that used to look fixed start to look very mutable, very malleable. Oh, you know what? Maybe like I've seen Jason, maybe I'll dig a pond here. Maybe this is where a pond is going to be. Obviously you can get carried away with that kind of thing because there's always this interaction between the given constraints of the situation and then what you do with it. But I think in this day and age, like fostering that, there's not a window here, but there's going to be, and you cut through the wall, that can be quite an epiphany to do that kind of a thing. And I had a very similar experience to Jason. One of the first things we built when we got here was a chicken coop. And, I got some plans off the web. I put it together. It works. It does what it's supposed to do. It's pretty much true and plumb, which was an achievement. And very, at the time I didn't know, is this thing going to come out all lopsided and stuff? It changes like what you think you might do or can do. And when it comes to like what can individuals do to start to take a step forward, it's that kind of a thing. Whatever the smallest thing you could do right now is, don't choose the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Don't choose the biggest thing. Choose the smallest thing you can think of and just do that thing. Build the chicken coop, plant the seed, put a planter in the window in your apartment, like the smallest freaking thing you can do. It's amazing how that can start to compound. And you look back and it's like, oh, that's only been 5 years since I did that. And I didn't know what I was doing at all. And now that's like old news. So yeah, I really love this idea of not just sort of expanding my own affordance space, but expanding it together. And in terms of like what comes bottom up, I mean, these kind of conversations we're having right now, I had no idea that I was headed towards a place in my life where I'd have conversations like this. Mm-hmm. It's all a surprise to me. Mm-hmm. And I'm really glad that we're having it. One of the things I'd like to I won't be able to do it in real time, but I want to think more about actually how do we leverage the information sharing among us like-minded folks. We're kind of doing it in a ad hoc way on Twitter and whatnot, but how do we actually start to share more nuanced and specific and granular details about what we're doing and how we might help each other even while we're far away? Obviously information transfer, but it strikes me also that if we did want to start to develop some kind of circularity in currency flow, for instance, among those who we have some confidence won't just be kind of exporting it out to the next global corporation immediately. Right. Maybe there are things that we can offer each other, say through the mail and things like that, and start to develop some of that economy. One of the things that strikes me is that we need to understand also, and that's sort of back to the theme of this conversation, that there's a difference between large scale and long range. And it's often the case that large scale things end up being long range because they're so large in scale that they just have a far reach. Like, it doesn't matter that you're in California, like you're within the reach of DC and it's long range. But it does also if you're in Virginia sitting right next to DC. That's not necessarily that long a range, but it's large scale. So one of the things that the internet and frankly all of the mail providers and whatnot could help us do is to have some more of these long range interactions that are still small scale, even though they're kind of operating over distance at the moment.
I mean, one of the things
for homesteaders.
What's that? Clubhouse for homesteaders?
Clubhouse for homesteaders. I haven't been on Clubhouse, but I hear it's kind of like a tech kind of founder space. And we need something like that for homesteaders.
Yeah. I went on there and it's definitely skewed towards technocratic type of discussions, at least from what I've seen. And right. we do need something where we're more intentionally exchanging our knowledge about this stuff, not just sort of in a haphazard way over Twitter and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, even small symbolic things. So for example, Vince Horn, who is a meditation guy, but he lives about 2 hours from me, and he's also starting up a homestead. Like, we send each other seeds. Like, he sent me some seeds from his grandfather grew, these squash, and I sent him some Cosmo flower seeds back. And we could have bought seeds elsewhere. We could have bought them from some vendor, but interpret it as like a symbolic act that kind of opens the gates for more of these kinds of interactions where we are helping each other both in terms of knowledge, but also in physical resources as well.
I think a seed exchange is a really good way to start too, because it is so, literally lightweight. So it's like no big deal to send some through the mail. Right. So maybe we should think more about that, because we save some seeds, we don't save everything, and it'd be great to kind of exchange and share.
One of the issues that we have, and that you both touched on, is that this kind of explicit verbal, propositional, and theoretical thinking that is so common and is so overweighted in kind of policy and larger scale decision making is simply a function of the fact that there's a certain type of thinking that fits onto pieces of paper and documents and like legal codes, and that level of sort of discursive infrastructure is so central to everything that gets moved around in the world, but it actually inhibits like a different kind of knowing and doing and a different kind of organizing.
This is sort of James C. Scott's seeing like a state legibility type of idea.
Is that right?
Yeah. What the state sees is what the state is able to write down, what it is able to put on its charts and tables, historically. And it's in a very literal sense blind to anything that can't be easily, even if in principle it might be able to, if it can't be kind of easily represented and written down. And so he calls it legibility. And it's highly constraining over what's able to be seen. And so in that sense, one of the things that we are doing, I believe, is we're showing each other what's possible. And that's actually huge in developing these affordance spaces locally. I mean, I think of something like skateboarding. So I was really into skateboarding when I was a kid. Back then, you could look at professional skaters and you'd think, oh yeah, maybe I could do that. Right. Now, if you look at professional skaters, they're like super athletes. They're like flipping 3 times in the air and stuff like that. And you're just like, all right, never mind. Like this is now like a hyper sport. But how did the sport evolve like that? And it's through this kind of cascade that happens when there's a, call it proof of existence event. So Tony Hawk does a 900. Okay, now a 900 is possible. Now, boom, 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 a year later, everyone's doing a 900, right? So this same kind of proof of existence of what's possible, I think is actually the most important thing that we can transmit digitally. You can't write it down. I can't tell you, here's exactly how to do it. I can give you some tips and this and that. You'll never know really how to do it till you try yourself, figure out what I wasn't able to write down and fail and then try again, et cetera. Right. But what we can show each other is what's possible. And already it happens for me all the time. I look at what Jason's doing. I look at what other people in our kind of Twitter sphere are doing, actively actually accomplishing. I say, oh, you know what? I thought that might be out of my reach, but look, Jordan Hedberg is now a professional cattle rancher, and that's what he does. And look at how good, he's putting up the fences and wrangling the cattle. This is something you can do. Right. Like it's going to take some learning. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's possible. And I think this kind of proof of existence, this demonstration of possibility, is one of the best things that we can use our long range informational connectivity for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one thing I mentioned on Twitter a couple of days ago is that I think this space is one of largely low tech, but it's one of the most innovative spaces. And part of it is because of the digital components. That's the high tech component of, like I can look on YouTube and see how to do many things. Of course, I'll have to adapt it to my circumstance. But also, many of us were not rich. And so, that having these constraints of having to be resourceful breeds creativity. Like I already see this taking off in kind of this alt ag, small farming, homesteading space. Like there's just so many resources already available. To be honest, I mean, part of the reason why I post things is to try and provide an example. But, to be honest, I also enjoy the encouragement, right? I appreciate the dopamine hit. Sure. And I think that's important. Like it's helping encourage me to do more. Right. And so we're providing inspiration to each other, like what we would have in like an old school, an old time village community where, you want to like show off for your neighbors. Right. And you want to help your neighbors. And because many of us don't have that, because a lot of that's been lost, we're cultivating that digitally, and hopefully over time it'll become more and more embodied, right, in actual communities.
I think that's a really great insight, Jason. Yeah, I'll bring it back to my skateboarding metaphor. When we'd skateboard back when we were kids, you might go out and skate by yourself once in a while, but usually not. You skateboard with your friends, and what do? You watch each other, and then you applaud, or like with the skateboard, you like hit the skateboard on the ground or on the coping to like sort of give a little applause when someone does something good. And I agree that is one of the things that we're really doing on social media right now is showing off, call it, here's what I did, here's what I was able to do, and enjoying the feeling of other people appreciating that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. I think that's actually a really good thing and very human. I don't know if either of you guys ever listened to Russ Roberts' Econ Talk podcast, but it's honestly one of the best podcasts out there if you enjoy kind of these very thoughtful and nuanced discussions and whatnot. Not every episode, right? But sometimes they really hit, and Russ is a very thoughtful interviewer and all of that. But one of the things, he's a huge Adam Smith fan, and one of the quotes he's constantly repeating from Adam Smith is like, it's about human motivation. What do humans want? And it's, in Adam Smith's words, to be loved and be lovely. And I think that this is hitting on that, like, to be lovely part. Right. Look at what's possible. Look at what I did with my bare hands. Let's keep compounding on this progress.
Yeah, and just to add on to that a little bit, like, it's not a selfish kind of adulation. Like, I can't even explain my own motivations, but when people ask me, like, how did you do that? Like, I'm very, very happy to to give people advice. Like, I like to see that other people are succeeding. And, I it's not that way because I've carefully, I've gone through the spiritual journey where, like, I like to give, but that's part of this, seems to be part of this kind of motivational structure that we evolved with, and can really help a movement get off the ground and innovate very, very quickly.
I'm going to make a bet that what we're talking about and what we're going to see emerge is some kind of a scaled mimesis that is essentially what Joe is talking about with skateboarding. I had exactly the same experience with mixed martial arts, where even, it was a thing even when I was a teenager, kind of in germ, but it was still kind of hard to, how are people putting this all together? What's the best way to train? What's the best way to practice? And then Instagram just kind of created this explosion of, people would just post their training videos, their sparring sessions, and you could just watch it and be like, this is literally the number one guy in the world, the number two guy in the world. This is what he's doing in his gym. I can just copy this, and it creates this like explosion of learning and innovation and participation, because it's something you can do, not at that level, but you have something to go off of, right? You're kind of doing the same thing on like one scale up. It's not just like one person copying another individual, but it's like, can I copy a homestead? Can I do the same kind of thing with homesteading? And maybe a level beyond that is like, can we do that kind of thing with township? You were talking earlier, Joe, that we've kind of lost some of those intermediary holes. This is like one of the things I love in Christopher Alexander is that, we need to get back into thinking about like actually constitutive, sort of substantial, relational, but substantial wholes. And right now it kind of seems like we have individuals and the state, and everything in between is kind of being hollowed out. And you have pockets of resistance and it's uneven and all of that, but like, you have individuals, you have families, you have communities or extended families, then communities, then towns, then regions, then states, then the country. We're kind of operating with just the small individual wholes and like one big sort of amorphous state. And so to like kind of create some kind of mimetic culture using the internet. Maybe this is like the question that I originally posed to you two coming on to the podcast is, what is the interface between localism and your use of Twitter and the internet? Maybe it is something like this. You're kind of like bootstrapping this kind of mimetic activity, but that's geared towards some of these intermediary holes that we've been missing. And maybe this is how we can sort of bring them back into the culture. Joe, I think we're about out of time with you. I don't know if you...
I just want to make a comment on that. Yeah. I absolutely agree. And, we haven't really mentioned it here explicitly, although it has been implied heavily, is that my idea of localism is this multi-scale idea. So it's just that, local at what scale, over for what function, for what purpose, like what are we really talking about? I think you said it while we were recording that, the kind of structure that we're talking about used to be the default structure. Why was it the default structure? Because the world imposed constraints such that was the only kind of thing that could form. There was no way to kind of subvert that. So now we have these connectivity technologies, both physical and informational, and we're able to subvert that structure. And so in addition to what can the internet offer us, which I think is good that we're kind of starting to pull that to the surface a bit, how can we leverage the situation to actually serve localism, even though it's a very non-local medium? the other piece is that we have to learn how to prevent it from subverting the situation, and it's no longer default. And so how do we preserve something that was default and was sort of unconscious? Now we're conscious of it. How do we get back to it?
Right.
And some of that has to do with adaptively disconnecting, choosing that, you know what, I'm going to have these conversations with other localists and homesteaders around. I'm actually going to just not have those other conversations right now and not have that noise transmitted into my local environment. Something that I personally, don't always succeed and find the right balance of. Sometimes I'm thinking too much about the Capitol riot or this or that, and maybe I shouldn't be thinking about that. Maybe that's hogging my attentional space. So as a community, I think we need to figure out how can this serve us, and then where is it doing the opposite, and how can we at least choose for ourselves to mitigate the cost associated with that.
Yeah.
Jason, I'll just add to that what Joe was saying, that there is a tension, right? Like I'm
right.
probably on Twitter more than I need to be in ways that are not conducive to my well-being and growth. We still have to navigate that tension, but yeah, the name of the game is to own the technology, not be owned by the technology.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of opportunity that this technology presents us.
Jason, we haven't had a Twitter fight in like a year. It seems like you've
I know
gotten under control.
I think I'm a little bit more careful in general. I used to get into a lot more battles, and part of that was just kind of fun. But now I pick them a little bit more wisely, I think. I still go after like the kind of the extropians, the techno-utopians. Like that's still a big target for me. I have no shame about that. I have no shame about going after Balaji or something. Even though I admire his decentralization ethic, there's other parts that I don't admire.
Balaji's a great one to go after because he's actually extremely insightful. So it's a worthy argument to have.
And he goes into the DMs, and then we have a conversation, and so I appreciate that he doesn't. Anyway.
Nice. Joe, you've got your courses. We didn't even talk about the courses, newsletter, Twitter, just anything else you want to share?
Yeah, I'm Normonics, Ormonics on Twitter. Like Jason, I'm on there too much, so you can find me there for sure. And I am doing some courses all online, Zoom courses. We're doing them synchronous, with Discord servers where we discuss things and whatnot. And that's actually been really, really awesome. The amount of interest that I found is frankly much larger than I had expected. And one of the things that I'm really benefiting from them because, people ask hard questions, and it's giving me the chance to align some of my revenue streams for my, pay the bills with the things that I really do care a lot about and I want to get deeper into, and I want people to ask hard questions, and I want to have those challenging discussions. So it was something that I thought would be nice, and it's turning out to be something that's actually much better than nice. It's transforming my life in many ways to be doing this. So yeah, that's something I'm doing. And if people are interested in that, you can reach out to me or check out my website.
Yeah, and I'm Cognizor on Twitter, and I don't besides teaching and working on the homestead, I don't have much else going on, but I love to talk with people and engage in these ideas.
Great. All right, gentlemen, thanks so much. This was a great conversation. I think people are going to get a lot out of it.
I hope so. And thanks.
Reach out to us if you're interested. People who hear this, if you're interested. Speaking for myself, I want to speak for Joe. Let's talk about this stuff. Give us your critiques. I love critiques. Steel sharpens steel. It helps flesh out my perspective, and so reach out to us.
Steel sharpens steel. Amen.
Amen.
Nice. All right. Thanks, guys.
Take care, guys.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
Bye.